Okay, is that working?
Yeah, looks good.
So I'm going to talk about Oxford Transport. It's a very broad overview. I'm not going to make any attempt to be comprehensive. I'm just going to pick a few important themes and try and bring those out. It's not at all original. There's nothing novel in this, but I hope that some of it will be new to people and may make people think about things again. It's mostly not Oxford specific. I mean, the details and the examples are all taken from Oxford, but the most of what I say is applicable to anything in the UK certainly, but probably much more broadly than even. And as Scott said, if there's any questions, send them to the OLS account via chat, and bring them up at the end. Okay, so a rough divide of Oxford's transport problems into three groups. The first one is the climate emergency and sustainability more broadly. The second one is peak hour congestion and hotspot air pollution. And the third one, a whole bunch of invisible or much less visible problems. So these are all interconnected, but they offer quite different perspectives. So I'm basically going to argue that too much attention in some ways has been paid to the second group of problems and not enough to the invisible problems. But we'll get to that. Okay, let's start with the climate emergency. So road transport accounts for about a quarter of UK carbon emissions and private cars for most of that. So electric vehicles are an important part of reducing this, but they're not a solution in themselves. So the basic problem is that we can't electrify fast enough. So there's a quote here from a recent piece from the Oxford Transport Studies Unit. But at the moment, I think 1 in 14 new cars in the UK is electric. So that sounds like a reasonable amount, but even if we managed to get that to 100% overnight, it would still take 15 to 20 years to electrify the existing car fleet, because that's the lifespan of cars. So it's simply not happening fast enough. And looking at the pace of charging infrastructure, it's clearly, well, you could say it's impossible, but it's a challenge that we're not really addressing. Perhaps a bigger problem is that manufacturing cars is itself carbon intensive, and electric vehicles are actually worse because they're heavier than conventional vehicles and they have batteries. So,
Danny, can I just query? I've just got a message from Stephen to say that people are not seeing slides.
What? Oh.
Can anyone else? Okay, Tom can see the slides. Nora can see the slides. Okay, I think, yeah, everyone can see the slides.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Stephen, I think that's unique to you. Okay, so off you go, Danny. And by the way, that gives me an excellent opportunity to introduce you, which I absolutely failed to do, Danny. Danny Yee is one of the 7 directors of Oxfordshire Livable Streets, a longtime Oxford resident as well. Yeah, and works at the university too. But okay, back to you, Danny. Thanks.
Okay. The other problem with electrification is that manufacturing cars is carbon intensive, and electric vehicles are worse because of their extra weight and because of the batteries. So it's very hard to estimate this because trying to work out how much carbon is embedded in something involves looking at supply chains and a lot of things. But it's possibly on the order of 5 to 10 tons of carbon for a normal sized vehicle. The amount of embedded carbon in cars will reduce as the broader economy decarbonizes. So with greener steel, for example, but that's not necessarily going to happen fast. So for that, we're dependent on the Australians decarbonizing iron ore mining, for example, and that kind of thing. Manufacturing multi-ton vehicles is going to remain resource intensive in other ways. So even if we forget about decarbonization and the climate emergency, manufacturing multi-ton vehicles just requires a lot of iron, copper, lithium, etc., which poses sustainability problems of its own. The UK has, and there's a kind of equity issue. The UK has almost 1 private motor vehicle for every 2 people. The world as a whole has maybe 1 for every 9 people. So either we're going to have to insist on more than our fair share of the world's resources, or we're going to have to accept the manufacture of 3 billion additional motor vehicles. So there's a kind of issue there. If we're going to lead the world in addressing sustainability and climate emergency, then we have to consider what we're asking other countries to do as well. So I'm going to reiterate this because I've already hammered this home because it's kind of an important point. The government, if you listen to most of the government, you'd think that electrification is what we need to do and that's the only problem and we will deal with that. But here's a quote from a parliamentary report from 2019, Technologies for Meeting the UK's Emission Targets. In the long term, widespread personal vehicle ownership does not appear to be compatible with significant decarbonisation. The government should not aim to achieve emissions reductions simply by replacing existing vehicles with lower emissions versions. Okay, so that's pretty to the point. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about decarbonisation there. There's some more links at the bottom of that if you want to look at the slides later. When it comes to congestion and hotspot air pollution, these are the problems the councils pay the most attention to, the county to the former and the city to the latter. So congestion is very visible, and forgive me for being a bit cynical, but it affected commuters from conservative rural wards as well as city residents. So that may be why the county paid some attention to it. Air pollution measurements on some of the fixed monitoring stations reached levels that were illegal. So that left the city council with potential liability. So that's why the city council is so concerned about air pollution hotspots. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to argue that not that these aren't important things, but that too much has relatively been paid to these problems and that's obscured other problems. So congestion, in a normal pre-pandemic working day, about 48,000 people commuted into Oxford and about 30,000 of them drove. So I think going back the other way, it's only about 10,000. So you see there's a clear imbalance. Housing growth inside Oxford, on its perimeter, in commuter towns, and employment growth is steadily increasing the number of people that need to move around Oxford and get into Oxford. And there's just a quote here from the Oxford Bus Company. Over the last 10 years, our buses have been getting slower as traffic levels in our city from private cars and vans has increased. Journey times have become longer, making each bus and driver less productive. This increases the cost of running our services and also makes them less attractive for customers to use. So that's just one example of the effects of congestion. There really isn't any more space in Oxford, and the only solution is to shift away from the least space efficient mode, which means fewer cars. So I don't think you'd find any disagreement about that. I mean, you could talk to a lot of transport planners and no one anymore believes that it's practical to build a dual carriageway across Christchurch Meadow or to flatten half of East Oxford to connect to it. In the 1970s, maybe that was conceivable, but now it's pretty clear that we have to make do with the space we have. So that said, congestion in Oxford is not actually that bad, at least by the standards of larger cities such as London or Sydney, where I come from. Possibly because it's just a smaller city, so there's still problems, but they tend to clear within reasonable timeframes. By 10 past 9 on a typical morning, the only hotspots left are really roadworks or crashes. For most of the day, the roads and junctions that are designed for peak hour volumes are unloaded, so there's no problem with that in most of the day. A bigger problem is lack of resilience, so it just doesn't cope with crashes or roadworks. So congestion is self-limiting. So this is something else that's very important to understand and that people don't really understand. But again, transport planners do, but they haven't sort of articulated it well to the general public, I could say. If we make changes to reduce congestion, so we add lanes to a freeway is the classic one, but in Oxford maybe we optimize some junctions for motor traffic support, then that reduces congestion and some people will switch to driving from other modes because it's now more attractive, undoing the game. So that's what's called induced demand. Conversely, if congestion gets worse, then some people will change routes, switch to working different hours, work from home, or cycle or bus instead. So that's the opposite induced demand, so traffic evaporation. In the very long term, or longer term, congestion is in a kind of balance with housing and employment via rents or house prices and salaries. So you can imagine if you made it much easier to get into Oxford via the Iffley Road, then that might affect house prices in, say, Didcot and Abingdon slightly and make it more likely for people to live in Kennington. Anyway, that's in the longer term. But so I think too much has been done in a way to address congestion. So the actual harms that have been done by attempts to reduce congestion. Every main road junction in Oxford has been designed to maximise motor traffic throughput at the expense of walking and cycling. I mean, I haven't looked at every junction in detail, but I've actually spent, an hour or two at several of them just watching what people do and timing movements and things like that. So some of them are quite startling. I timed one at 6 minutes for single pedestrian movement, which is ludicrous on the face of it. But there are 8 lanes for motor traffic. This is the Marston Junction. Extra lanes have been given to right-turning motor traffic and for buses at the expense of adequate pavements and cycle lanes. Photo that somewhere, I might show later. And motor traffic has been allowed to take over side streets that are totally unsuited for high volumes of traffic, and that inhibits walking and cycling or even short local trips. So I think I've got anyway, attempts to reduce congestion that cripple alternative modes are not the way forward, even if they worked, which they clearly haven't. So if you manage to reduce congestion at the expense of making cycling more hostile and less pleasant, then that's not going to stop the number of cars on the road, because some people are going to switch to driving from cycling because cycling is now less attractive, that kind of thing. So here's one example. This is just Old Road. This was rebuilt in 2016 to 2017, and the changes were road alignment amended to accommodate 2-lane approach out of Roosevelt Drive, so an extra right-hand turn lane on the one approach that lacked it. 2-lane approach storage increased, meaning car storage, of course, on Old Road. There was a refugee island widened on Warneford Lane, but otherwise these changes made things worse for walking and cycling. There are now 3 lanes to get across on Roosevelt Drive, and the cycle lane on Old Road has been shunted onto the pavement. So you have to sort of hop sideways to get onto it and then hop off it, sideways to get off it. As you can see, the person in the picture is not using the cycle lane. This is kind of typical of Oxford's cycling provision, where we're given 2 options, neither of them good, instead of 1 functional option. So the other high profile thing is air pollution. Some stretches of Oxford roads had pre-pandemic measurements above legal air pollution limits. So the City Council's attempts to address this involve 0 and low emission zones starting in the city centre. Electric vehicles will help with pollution, but they're not a panacea, since they still produce particulate emissions from tyre wear and road dust suspension. And since they weigh about 20% more for the same size, that's actually those 2 sources of particulate emissions are actually slightly worse. Focusing on hotspots, so the few places we happen to have monitoring, and arbitrary legal limits obscure the broader problem of air pollution. It's kind of like looking for lost keys under the streetlights. There's no safe level of air pollution, so it affects lots and lots of different aspects of health. There's studies after studies showing it affects X, Y, and Z, and more things than you want to think about. But even particulate PM 2.5 concentrations below 12 micrograms per cubic meter, which is half the legal UK limit, significantly increased death rates. So that's the citation at the bottom of the page from a recent, very large US study. Short periods passing through pollution hotspots may be a lot less significant than all-day pollution. So if you spend 5 minutes walking through St. Clement's on your way to work, that's one of the hotspots. That's not good, but if you spend 8 hours in a workplace that's polluted or in a playground that has pollution, that may be a much bigger contribution to your net pollution intake, as it were. We need a lot more and better data on this. There's a lot of interesting science because it spans, as you can see, lots of different fields: physics, epidemiology, architecture, etc. Okay, now we're going to what I call invisible transport problems. These are things that people don't do or perhaps can't do. So trips that they don't make at all, transport modes people don't have access to, and so forth. So it's basically forms of transport poverty. These are invisible partly because they're things that aren't happening, so you can't see them by definition, and also because the people involved often don't realize things could be otherwise. So we've got so used to car dominance, which is mostly the source of the problems, that we don't realize that we could have local streets that don't have thousands of car movements a day, things like that. So it's mostly about public transport and active travel, but I'll begin with cars themselves. If you look at the problems faced by people who don't have access to a motor vehicle, so many services just assume you have access to a car. So some COVID testing or vaccination sites are hard to get to without a car, or even drive-in only. So I know people who tried to book, vaccinations only to be told they had to drive to Wantage or something like that, or get to Wantage somehow. In the 2011 census, a third of Oxford households had no car or van. And of course, some people in those that do have a car or van may not have access to the vehicle. 25% of UK adults don't have a driving license. Car-centric planning and subsidies curtail independent child mobility, so no children between 5 and 16 drive, and they exclude many disabled and older adults who may not be able to drive. And women are less likely to have a driving license and less likely to have access to a car. So people talk about cycling, not everyone being able to cycle. Actually, the accessibility of cycling is vastly higher than the accessibility of driving once you take these things into account, that you're excluding all children under 16 and a lot of adults. Buses. Oxford has a decent bus network, but often there's no suitable bus service. The service frequencies are too low or the trips take too long. Getting to or from the bus stops is hard. They're too far away, or getting to them involves hostile streets. So there's a particular problem again, frailer adults, people with children. There may be no room for the buggy or the wheelchair on the bus, or the fares are too expensive. Cycling. For a lot of cases, cycling is the best way to get around Oxford. Anybody who's actually done it much will realise that. It's fast. So the Pedal and Post Company claims they've halved the times for getting critical medical supplies from manufacturing sites to the Churchill and the JR. It's reliable. It's another issue with critical supplies. There's very low variation in journey times. It's cheap. You don't need a fancy bike for short get around town trips. You know, you can buy something if you have to for £100 from a second-hand shop. And it's sustainable. So energetically, cycling is the most efficient to pretty much any form of transport. And even if you look at e-bikes, the batteries are hundreds of times smaller than electric vehicle ones. So you can have one big electric SUV, or you can have like 200 electric bikes. But people aren't cycling. So this is, again, this is a bit counterintuitive. People look at Oxford and they look at all those people cycling. But actually, that was my first reaction when I came to Oxford and about the first year there. And then after I started talking to people, I realized how many people don't cycle or will only cycle occasionally. If we look at Dutch cycling levels, Oxford cycling rates are about 1/3 of what they could be, I reckon. Very few children and older, frailer adults cycle. Many people only cycle a few safe and familiar routes. They might cycle with the kids to school, but they won't cycle anywhere else, or they only cycle on Sundays when there's less traffic and they're going on a recreational trip somewhere. Even looking at young adults, only half of Oxford University students cycle and far fewer Brooks students. So in the Netherlands, this is well over 90% in that age group, 18 to 24-year-olds, say. And the answer is quite obvious. If you ask people, the main reason is too much motor traffic and hostile roads. The roads, especially junctions, are hostile for cycling. If you want to get from East Oxford into the city centre, you've got to get through the plain or take various roundabout routes. If you want to get from East Oxford to Headington, you've got to go up Divinity Road, or you've got to go up the Holloway or Headington Road. And there's a nice quote from a report on cycling in Oxford by Andrew Gilligan with the National Infrastructure Commission. Despite the huge numbers of cyclists using them, Oxford's main roads and junctions are still laid out almost entirely for the benefit of the motor vehicle. So basically, that's the reason people don't cycle. Walking, at least we can still walk everywhere. So yes and no. Crossing main roads can be stressful or dangerous. Smaller streets with high volumes of traffic, but no formal crossings can be worse. The main road junctions in Oxford are anti-pedestrian. So I mentioned before that I timed one at 6 minutes. The one nearest me requires 4 stages for some movements, and some of them don't even have pedestrian faces at all. So, you know, the Henley Avenue, Church Cowley Road junction has no pedestrian phases, but the main roads carry something like 12,000 motor vehicles on the T-bar, and 6,000 on the side road, as it were. The pavements are often too narrow or parked on or shared with people cycling. And of course, all this is worse for children and their carers, or for slower or frailer adults. They're more likely to be hit because they're slower, and they're more likely to be badly injured or killed if they are hit by vehicles. A couple of more examples of this. So there are children who live less than 500 meters away from my daughter's school, but are driven there. And that seems ridiculous, and probably it is ridiculous, but if you think that what might be a 6-minute walk becomes 10 minutes once you take the junction crossing time into account, and that extra 4 minutes is pretty unpleasant. So spent standing in mid-junction cages on the road or the edge of the road, and that someone walking their kids to school and going back will have to do this 4 times a day, 5 days a week. So they're looking at spending an hour and 20 minutes every week, basically sitting in the middle of a junction, or standing in the middle of a junction, I assume. People can find even getting across the street outside their house hard. This is a quote from a friend of mine. One of the worst points for us, this was before the Cowley LTNs, was actually crossing the road just outside our house on Cowley Road, Littlemore. It could take a good 5 minutes to get a safe gap in the traffic, which included HGVs regularly. The street I live on has no coordinated drop curbs for a wheelchair or buggy in over 500 meters. And it's also got nowhere to sit for anyone who finds walking 700 meters tiring. So it's not pedestrian friendly. One more multimodal example. So this is getting into town. Central Oxford has free museums and other great resources for families with children, but how do they get there from Cowley? So it's too far to walk. I know Scott will walk it with his kids, but most people with small children, that's a little bit too far. If the parents are confident, then cycling with infants or small children is relatively easy because child bike seats are cheap and easy to fit on bikes. But moving older children involves either expensive cycles, so you tandems, cargo bikes, trailers, or having the children cycle on their own bikes on roads that many adults in Oxford won't cycle on. A family day bus pass is £8.50, which is a significant constraint for some families, and that's the same families who are least likely to have cars. So the worst effects of all of this, as it were, transport poverty, are physical and social inactivity. So physical inactivity is a huge contributor to health problems. It's not that physical activity will keep you alive longer necessarily, but it might mean that the last 30 years of your life are largely mobile and not painful, as it were. It makes a huge contribution to things like diabetes or arthritis, things like that. Preaching exercise has very limited success. What actually works is embedding exercise in everyday life, and the easiest way to do that by far is active travel. So, trying to get people to go back to, I don't know, mangling the laundry by hand is a non-starter, whereas if you make it attractive, people actually enjoy walking to work. I saw a study recently saying that if people actually enjoy their commutes or not, whether if they could teleport to work, whether they would or not, and by and large, the people who walk and cycle to work, many of those would actually pass up the teleport to work because they actually enjoy it. And social inactivity is often a concomitant of transport poverty. Hostile main roads and junctions, side streets carry too much traffic, etc., all contribute to community severance. There's a famous study by Donald Appleyard showing that people had more friends if they lived on streets with less traffic, and that was repeated recently in Bristol with the same results. So most of these problems result from too many cars, and we're kind of going the wrong way. This is also harking back to the decarbonisation problem. As you can see from these graphs, there was a slight dip after the recession in 2008. But otherwise, the number of miles travelled on roads in Oxfordshire is steadily climbing again. There's a study that shows that most of this traffic is going onto residential streets rather than A or B roads. So the A or B roads are already congested, so it's now being pushed down residential streets. And again, so you can see that motor traffic is a problem in different ways. Depending on what you're worried about, a 500 metre school run drive might be worse than 50 miles driven on a motorway. Obviously, the first is worse for road danger, and the second is far worse for carbon emissions. So I won't go through that in detail. What do we need to do? So looking at decarbonisation and noting that urban areas are going to have to do more than rural areas, and picking a few ballpark numbers, Oxford needs to aim for maybe 25% of current car numbers and maybe 50% of current car miles. Okay, so it's quite drastic. If you're wondering about the discrepancy between those two numbers, why we're reducing car numbers much more than car miles, the reason is that the people who drive most are the ones who are least likely to give up car ownership. And also that people who currently have cars but only use them occasionally are going to continue driving, but they'll be using car clubs, car sharing, taxis, car hire, etc. And this will solve our other problems too. So if we had a 50% reduction in traffic in Oxford, that would reduce congestion enough for both free bus flow and a major reallocation of space and time to active travel. It would also significantly improve air pollution on all streets, not just in the hotspots, and free up space for public realm improvements. So that's kind of what we're at. We need massive traffic reduction. How do we achieve this? We know what we need to do. We need a shift from driving to walking, cycling, and public transport. We need a shift from car ownership to use of taxis, car club vehicles, hire cars, and car share schemes. We might need, well, this is perhaps longer term, but some of it could be shorter term, some rebalancing of employment and housing, and of people and services more generally. So we need a shift to local business and 15-minute city. So people may need to shift to buying things from their corner store, augmented with online shopping rather than driving twice a week to a ring road supermarket and doing a massive shop that way. It's going to need both carrots and sticks, a broad range of policy tools, because it's quite a big change and it involves lots of aspects of transport. One of these, and a key one of these, is demand management. That's basically transport planner jargon for deterring car use. It should refer to reducing demand by reducing the requirements for mobility or demand for mobility, but it actually just refers to deterring car use. There's a number of options for this. There's four I've listed here, kind of the obvious ones. One is parking controls. If people can't park, they can't drive somewhere. So that's a workplace parking levy, controlled parking zones, etc. Another is mode priority, so bus gates, low traffic neighborhoods. Another one is road pricing or congestion charging. So road pricing is a broader term, just refers to charging for use of the roads. Congestion charging is specifically for entering certain zones or at certain times. So it's a form of road pricing, but more narrowly targeted. And rationing. So this would be, for example, only odd-numbered plates allowed to drive on Mondays or something like that. The councils have opted for mode priority and parking controls. So that's connecting Oxford and low traffic neighbourhoods and controlled parking zones. So connecting Oxford, this is a huge reworking of Oxford transport as it needs to be. We can't do this by small changes. We have to take a larger scale perspective and look at the whole city at once and the settlements around it. So it involves a workplace parking levy to deter commuter driving and raise money for active travel and public transport improvements. New bus routes and new park and rides, the latter well outside Oxford, so for example in Aynsham. Bus gates prioritising buses on key routes, so this is like High Street on a larger scale. Freeing up space and time for active travel. And I think it should also include public realm improvements. One of the gains from removing motor traffic is reclaiming space for other purposes. So the model here, or closest to model, I think, to what we're trying to do is Ghent. So this video is 10 minutes long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I highly recommend it, and the link is there. Ghent managed to achieve a massive shift to active travel and public transport quite quickly and without building a huge pile of infrastructure. They basically said they couldn't afford to do what Utrecht had done, and so they had to do it on the cheap. There's also a second video looking at the political challenges involved and how that worked out. So, oops, that seems to have started anyway. I don't know what anything is.
Where there are 7 parts. There's a car-free zone in the center, and then 6 parts around it. For pedestrians, for cyclists, for public transport, nothing changed. But for car drivers, something changed. If they wanted to go from one part to another part, they had to go to the ring road. There was no connection between the parts possible with the car. So you get fewer cars.
We are here at the F50, as we called it in Ghent, which is the inner ringway. If you have to go from one section to another section, you have to pass via this ringway. This means that you see a lot more cars here.
There's since the circulation plan has been introduced, we can see that there's absolutely a decrease in the number of cars in the city, an increase in walking and cycling. It also goes hand in hand with the parking measures that have been introduced. So we have more parking on the border of the city and people just walking or cycling or using public transport to enter the city.
The circulation plan was actually part of the mobility plan that also included the parking plan, the plan to the whole cycling network in the city of Ghent. And the targets within the mobility plan were set on 35% for cycling in 2030. Now, 2 years after the circulation plan, we have a mode share of 35%, which was actually the target for 2030. So it seems that we have to rethink about the.
Anyway, that's so that's the circulation plan. Low traffic neighborhoods. To fully enable active travel, everyone has to be able to walk and cycle around local streets safely, easily, directly, and comfortably. So we'll talk about 8 to 80 cycling, but we also need 2 to 100 walking. We need people in wheelchairs and pushing buggies, visually impaired, and so forth to be able to get around. This is just not compatible with high volumes of motor traffic, even with traffic calming. So as everyone knows, probably Reimer's Lane was my favorite example of this, with 14 sets of chicanes and speed humps. It's now got a modal filter on it, so you can't experience the horror, but you could try going up Divinity Road at peak hour and see how much fun that is. These streets are too narrow to reclassify as B roads and provide cycle lane signals, crossings, etc. And that would be going the wrong way anyway. We need to reduce motor traffic, not encourage it. Main roads and junctions, we have to rebuild the main roads and junctions to prioritize walking and cycling rather than motor traffic throughput. So we need more pedestrian crossings, longer pedestrian phases, adequate cycle lanes, support for cycle turning movements, and so forth. Inside Oxford, bus priority needs to be achieved by traffic reduction. There just isn't room for dedicated bus lanes when we also need cycle lanes. And this is kind of off topic, but if we really want to sort of influence longer trips and intercity trips, then motorways should have a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit because that's energetically more efficient. But buses and coaches could be allowed to do 60 miles per hour and given exclusive use of the outside lane. So there you go. In addition to the bigger changes, we need lots of little ones, more dropped curbs, more trees, better bus stops, places to sit, wider pavements and narrow carriageways, continuous pavements across side roads, places to shelter from the sun and rain, and so forth. So there's 2 things here. There's a healthy streets checklist produced for Transport for London originally, and I've got a link to a blog post that talks about one of these things in particular, continuous pavements. So buses, the Oxford Bus Company is quite clear on this. Fixing congestion is just as important as technology in decarbonising our transport system. Many people say, well, we need to make the buses free before we do anything to tackle transport. But as you can see in the quote, we need to fix congestion first, and then we need to maybe make buses cheaper. Making buses cheaper would certainly be good, but fares are only one obstacle to bus use. So Tallinn in Estonia made public transport free, but they did an audit of that, and while it's been well used, it has failed to shift people from driving. So you can't just drive people out of their cars by offering them free buses. Maybe in some cases you can, but it has to be part of a broader package of measures. Operating subsidies are also very expensive. It might be on the order of, I don't know, £20 million a year or something if you wanted to make buses just inside Oxford free. If Oxford and Oxfordshire have money for public transport, I think it would be much better targeted at bootstrapping new routes and new services, such as the pick-me-up bus, at better infrastructure, bus stops and active travel links to them, and so forth. And it's rural areas which are likely to need transport subsidies, not denser urban areas like Oxford. So electrifying everything, yes, we need to electrify everything, but we need to concentrate on essential vehicles and the ones that do the most mileage. So buses and trains, car club vehicles, taxis, hire cars, etc., delivery and service vehicles, and then people who really need them, vans for tradespeople, and cars for people with disabilities or living in locations where alternatives are unavailable. And at the end here, so if you're already walking, cycling and using public transport as much as possible, and you don't use your car very much, then really you should just try to give up a car and switch to taxi and car club use, or keep your old car running. What you don't want to do is buy a brand new electric car and use it to drive 1,000 miles a year or something like that. That would be entirely counterproductive. Moving forward, so we can't do something like connecting Oxford incrementally. It requires a jump into some uncertainty. So anytime you try to model something, whether it's as big as connecting Oxford or smaller scale like a low traffic neighborhood, there's a lot of uncertainty. You're basically modeling behavior change and you're plugging in numbers for how many people will switch to cycling to school instead of driving if the drive is made 2 minutes longer and the cycle route is now largely traffic free. And we don't have good numbers for that kind of thing. We need to prepare as much as we can, then move forward fast while maintaining the flexibility to mitigate any problems and to take advantage of opportunities. We don't have time to make small changes and do detailed evaluations of them or worry about them causing a bit of extra congestion. So we can't just rework a junction here, put in a cycle lane there, add a pedestrian crossing there, and then wait to see what happens. We know we need all those things. We just have to do them. We have a pretty good idea what the goal is, and we're in a bit of a hurry. So problems have to be addressed by additional forward movement, not by going backwards. So we're trying to wage World War II blitzkrieg, not World War I trench warfare, as it were, I guess. Thinking back to decarbonisation again, it's both cheaper to rebuild for active travel and public transport than to create charging infrastructure for the entire existing vehicle fleet. So in some ways that this message is, people should welcome this message, but on the other hand, the personal changes required are much harder. So electric vehicles offer the mirage of business as usual. Basically, no one will have to change the way they live very much. And you can contrast that with other decarbonisation problems. So decarbonising household heating is going to require huge infrastructure investment, insulation and heat pumps, and basically rebuilding a lot of the housing stock, but very little behavioural change. If your boiler was switched to running hydrogen instead of natural gas, you probably wouldn't notice. And similarly, decarbonising industry, steel, cement, fertilizers, and so forth is a huge challenge, but it's going to be mostly invisible to people. So behaviourally, it's not a problem. How do we make transition to a more sustainable transport system fair and equitable? So we need to support people who are adversely affected by the changes, providing them the best possible range of alternative options. But we should also consider gains that can accompany the transition. So enabling walking, cycling, and public transport, not just for the people who are shifting from driving, but for people for whom those may be currently inaccessible. So this is the invisible problems in transport poverty. The challenges we're facing are also opportunities to address transport poverty and transport inequality. Oxford is better placed than many cities, so certainly rural areas, it's relatively compact, it's got relatively high levels of cycling, it's got a functional bus system, and it's relatively affluent, even if it's very unevenly distributed. So we may have to do more than our share. It's got special challenges. Obviously, it's a huge employment hub and a tourist destination, and it's got a radial structure resulting from the river geography, although that might actually make implementing a Ghent-style circulation plan easier. There aren't that many routes you need to filter. How am I going for time? Okay, I'm going to quickly run through a few things just because they're fun. It's hard to imagine an alternative when one lives one whole life in a car-dominated environment. So in 1950, more miles were cycled than driven in the UK. And in 1960, factory workers cycling for home could still completely take over the Cowley Road. But that's out of living memory for most of us. This is the nadir of British utility cycling. This is the economist wondering what technology could possibly fill the gap between walking and cars, so between a third of a mile and 3 miles, and fantasizing about mini trams. Mind-boggling. Anyway, so this is what we know is the alternative. This is Amsterdam modal share by distance in 2012. So the bottom shows various distances, and the red is cycling, the grey at the bottom is cars, the white is pedestrians. So as you can see, for distances between 1 kilometre and 8 kilometres, cycling is the plurality choice, majority choice in a lot of it, clear majority. This is from 2012, so Amsterdam has further prioritised walking and cycling in the last decade, and electric bikes have really taken off. So I would expect if this was redone, there would be even more cycle use and it would extend to even longer distances. So if you think about 8 kilometres, that's 5 miles, that covers almost all trips inside Oxford's Ring Road. And from Carfax, it reaches out to Radley, Cumnor, Farmore, Yarnton, South Kidlington, and almost to Wheatley. So that gives you some idea of the potential scope of cycling if properly enabled. Here's another one. This is Dutch secondary schools, how children get to school. 75% of them cycle to school. And 46% of the children going to school are traveling more than 5 kilometers. So the interesting thing here is how few walk, even though for many of them the distances you think were too short to cycle. And the reason for that is that they want to be able to go with their friends after school to wherever their friends are going. So Dutch children have among the highest levels of independent mobility in Europe because they have the ability to cycle safely pretty much anywhere. And this extends, I mean, children are an indicator species. If you see children cycling and walking, then generally it's safe for 70-year-olds to cycle or walk as well. The Netherlands has a remarkably flat cycling distribution out to like 70 because people use electric bikes and just keep cycling. And more women than men cycle in the Netherlands, which is quite the contrast to the UK, where I think it's still almost like 2 to 1 men cycling over women. And one last thing, this is possibly not something we could consider in the UK, but it just shows you how a different way of thinking about things produces completely different results. So in Japan, not only do you need to have a parking place in order to register a car, you have to prove you have a parking place, but there's a ban on overnight on-street parking. And there's no tolerance for like 10-minute parking. So this is what Tokyo streets look like. And if you look very carefully here, you can see that's a one-off, one-car parking place. It's about £20 a day. So it's just a completely different way of approaching parking to here. So anyway, I'll just quick run down Oxfordshire livable streets was up in 2018. We're inspired by Dutch and Belgian models, Groningen, Ghent, Utrecht, but also by Waltham Forest and Hackney in London. And there's a pile of other organisations if you want to get involved. There's mode-specific ones. There's ones focused on different aspects of, and then there's lots of local organisations as well. Low Carbon Hub, or Livable Streets organisations, local groups in the Oxfordshire Cycling Network, and so forth. So I will just okay. So that takes 3/4 of an hour. So were there any questions? I guess there must be some questions.
So Danny, I've got loads of the questions here, I think. Can I just fire some of them at you?
Yep.
So one person just said, well, our roads are quite narrow, the radial routes especially. So how about making the radial routes one way to free up more space for walking and cycling?
So that was actually Oxfordshire Livable Street's first idea. We had a brainstorming session and basically lots of people sat down and people said, we could make these one-way pairs. I mean, obviously Banbury and Woodstock Road are an obvious candidate. Things get a bit trickier with Abingdon or Botley roads or things like that. I think if you can get enough traffic reduction, then it stops being so much of a problem. And there's a lot of, well, I guess you could say the main problem is the buses. You want to be able to run bus routes as close to people as possible. And if you've got a one-way system that either involves esoteric, much longer bus routes, I guess, trips, or much longer walks to get to a bus that's going the way you want to go. So for me, I think that the main reason for that is, the main problem with that idea is trying to route buses safely.
Okay, here's a question about demand management, which was a big part of your presentation. So this person says that this sounds like a crude instrument penalizing people who need to drive in the course of their work, such as tradespeople. The car journeys we need to prioritize for reduction are those for which there are alternatives. We already have such things as disabled parking permits. Are there other examples of finer tuned methods than the demand management strategies that you've outlined?
Yes, so this is a major problem of all these schemes, is that really you want to address just those people for whom it's easiest to switch to other modes and not the ones for whom it's hardest. But we have no way of working that out. So, congestion charging, for example, will affect people who are poor rather than people who are wealthy. Wealthy people will just see it as a fee that they pay, whereas it will deter people who really need to drive and don't have good alternatives but can't afford it. So there is a real problem here, but there is no easy answer. So one possibility would be exemptions for groups of people. So obviously you can exempt blue badge holders. You could exempt deliveries, although really you want to exempt, you want to push as much as possible to cargo cycle freight as you can. So there are options for that. So you could do that with any of these systems. So you could do road pricing based on what the vehicle is and who the owner is, for example. You could do a congestion charge the same way. You could allow exemptions to bus gates based on, again, what the vehicle is and who's in it. So there are options for this, but they are admittedly not imperfect. So there's unfortunately no way of doing this nicely.
And we should be mindful that the one existing ANPR filter point in Oxford on a main route, which is High Street, has very, very limited exemptions, actually.
Yes, I mean, but so the question is, you'd have to you have to work out, I guess, the political decision as to what the exemptions would be and how they'd be managed. I mean, maybe it's better that they have to be slightly crude rather than, you know, sort of some ultra fine-tuned system where, you know, somebody goes into HMRC and pulls out how much tax you've paid and tries to bill you based on that or something like that. So there's a trade-off between administrative costs as well. But anyway, there are some options there. We can exempt people.
Sorry, Danny. You mentioned the Ghent scheme, and you showed us a little bit of the video clip, you know, segmenting the city into different segments that can't be driven across except by recourse to the ring road. Someone here mentions that Oxford's ring road consists in part of some major national trunk roads, and that must make it different in Ghent. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes. So a problem is that Oxford ring road is not high quality. I mean, you could say that's true of UK roads generally compared to Dutch ones, unfortunately. But I mean, it's not even connected. The A34 isn't properly connected to the A40, for example. And there's large stretches of it where there's still pedestrians crossing. You know, at Barton Park, they put in a pedestrian crossing of what's effectively a dual carriageway in the main ring road. So it is a problem. The poor quality of the ring road and the fact that it is also shared with through traffic is a problem. So I mean, you could argue that this needs to be done in the context of some even broader strategy for transport management. But you know, we can't wait on the national government to start restricting, you know, main road traffic or trying to reduce traffic.
So here's a question about, you know, great ideas. How do we finance them, particularly since local government has already been so underfunded? Of course, you mentioned the workplace parking levy, which is going to pay for some of this. What else would you say about that?
So I would say that part of the attraction is that this is a relatively cheap way of doing things. The reason they did it in Ghent was, I think there's an explicit quote by the deputy mayor saying that they couldn't afford to do what Utrecht had done, which is to basically do everything nicely, and so they'd done it on the cheap. In the same way that low traffic neighbourhoods are relatively cheap to implement. I mean, people think they're expensive, but it's actually the entire Cowley, all three Cowley LTNs cost less than a single zebra crossing, or a single signalised crossing, I think. Similarly, would be relatively cheap to implement in the grand scheme of things. The problem is going to be managing all the other features, managing like enabling cycling and walking and buses and stuff like that.
I'm going to be quite pacey with some of these questions because they're stacking up, and just to warn everyone else that you may be disappointed because we will run out of time here in about 10 minutes. So this person says, I would like to ask, what do we do to move away from the current car dominant culture where being able to drive everywhere is seen as a right?
I don't know. I mean, I can conceive of a situation where in 20 years, I mean, car advertising is banned on television in the same way that advertising cigarettes is banned on television at the moment, or banned completely anywhere. But it's going to require as big a shift But I guess you could say if you went back in time and asked somebody 20 or 30 years ago whether they could imagine a world in which smoking was basically not allowed anywhere and you weren't even allowed to talk about it really, they might look at you incredulously too. So it may be possible. I think in some ways you have to put the facts into place on the ground first. If people just can't drive certain routes or it's too unwieldy, they won't. And once people stop doing it, they'll stop thinking it's the only way to do things.
Okay, good. Question here. What is the equivalent of connecting Oxford for market towns?
So I was looking at some of these. Some of them have kind of ring roads and bypasses. So in some of them, bypasses have been built, but the town still has a through route. And you could conceivably do the same thing. Desegregate the sort of use mode priority to stop through traffic continuing to use the center of the town and push it out to use the bypasses and thus free up like walking and cycling routes. Some of these towns are small enough that you should almost be able to cycle anywhere. So rather than Ghent or Utrecht, maybe example might be Houghton or somewhere like that, which is actually small enough that pretty much every trip inside the town is cyclable and or walkable. So places like Bicester, on a small scale, Brackley, Whitney, you'd have to look at the, it depends on the actual situation on the ground, but there are certainly ways in which you could push traffic out of internal areas in order to free up routes for other modes.
Cool. I'm going to move us along. One question here is, have you seen any change from the county with respect to ambition since there was the change of control on May 6th?
They've been very quiet. So they haven't exactly come out with stirring rhetoric or much in the way of sort of follow me leadership yet. That's either because they're still getting their feet, or maybe it's because they're all suddenly getting a bit nervous. Part of the problem may be that there's this transition from representing a single division or ward and trying to represent a whole county. Once you get to that level, you've got to sort of ignore people who are unhappy to some extent. You can't make everybody happy. Whereas if you're dealing with local issues at a local level, to a much bigger extent, you can try and find compromises that will make everybody happy. Once you get to a larger scale, there are always going to be people who are very unhappy with major changes. And I'm not sure that our new county government has quite come to terms with that yet.
And Danny, it's been suggested that when I'm speaking, maybe you could go on mute because there's some echoing or something.
Okay.
I'm not going to do much talking. Someone's asking here, what ideas do you have, or what ideas are you actually seeing in practice which do persuade people to give up their cars altogether and say adopt a car sharing approach? And has anywhere really managed to do this that you know?
So I don't know much about this, but it seems to me that even just the recession in 2008 caused some people to give up cars or to reduce driving. So there's a fair bit of flexibility in the system. There's a lot of cars. If you look at any streets inside Oxford at, say, 11 o'clock in the morning, there are clearly a lot of cars that are not being used that much. So if you ask people to give up driving completely, most people will say, no, that's too hard. But if you say, well, here's car club membership, you can just hire a car when you want it, or that's a lot easier. So we basically need drastically ramped up car club provision, I think, to start with. We're going to need more taxis probably, and car sharing schemes, which is something I hadn't thought of before. But again, if your neighbours don't have a whole pile of cars and only 1 in 10 of you use them on a typical day, then you don't actually all need to own a car. So it's hard to know. I mean, I would say financial issues may push people. Seeing other people do it may make it easier. At the moment, there's relatively few people have done it. Most people don't know anybody who's done it, or they know 1 or 2 people. Like anything else, once you know, like several of your friends have done it, it becomes much easier.
So we know from research that LTNs themselves do induce a pretty significant amount of shift out of personal private car ownership. Probably not at a quick enough rate, but we know that there's something's going on there. And of course, that could be probably accentuated with better club car provision, which hopefully is coming here. Had another question here, and which was that, and how, to what extent have you thought about ways that COVID, or coming out of COVID, changes things for transport, and in a way that maybe opens up new opportunities or really changes the kind of variables here?
I don't think it changes things that much. I mean, the first lockdown had a massive effect on traffic levels. You could just walk around the streets and you could see that there just weren't any cars. But ever since then, people have been getting sort of back to normal, and it's really hard to distinguish this much from the situation pre-COVID, I would say. There's still some reluctance to use buses, which is a bit of a problem. But I don't think traffic levels are very much. I would say that's being balanced by people continuing to work from home. Maybe some of that will stick. Maybe people will realize the working from home is actually an option for a lot of people, and so that would help a fair bit with transport.
Are you familiar with closed loop car share schemes? So peer-to-peer, where people rent their own car to other people or share their own car?
That's what I was mentioning, sort of car sharing rather than formal car club schemes. So I think people are trying to work on that in IFLI fields at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. But I've never had any experience with it myself. But it's certainly, like I said, you see these rows of cars if you walk around much of Oxford that are just not being used. They move, well, when the figures, they move 5% of the time. If that 95% or more, they spend the time sitting in the street doing nothing at all.
What would you do with the carriageway space that you free up by removing a car? Just leave it for...
So on main roads, we need to get rid of the car parking to put in cycle lanes, cycle tracks. On the side streets, if we manage to get rid of more of the cars, then I would like to see them replaced by, well, lots of things: parklets, seating, trees, bike storage, so bike hangers for people to store bikes securely in. We could have the footpaths back, so about half of the space in East Oxford could immediately be reclaimed to make both footpaths fully car free. So there's a lot of things you could do with that space.
Great. Well, Danny, I think it just remains for me to say thank you for that real tour de force. Lots of clapping going on out there. Thank you to the audience for being so patient and being muted the whole way through and not even being able to chat with one another. I know it's difficult, but thank you so much, everyone. And to answer your question, this presentation will be loaded up onto YouTube so you can share it widely. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, Danny. Thanks, everyone.